So, we have here our next lesson on biomolecules. This lesson, we're going to focus on carbohydrates. So, the monomer of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. And hopefully, you remember that mono means one. So, literally, that means one saccharide, and saccharide actually means sugar. So literally monosaccharide translates to one sugar. So these are simple sugars. Some of the more common ones are glucose, fructose, and galactose, but the really big one for us is going to be glucose. So monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, galactose have this general formula of CH2O. What you might notice is that for every carbon that they contain, they also have, apologies for that extra line, they also have the equivalent of one molecule of water. That's where carbohydrates get their name from. It is literally watered carbon or watery carbon. And then this CH2O formula is multiplied however many times. So for however many carbons you have, you're going to have two hydrogens and one oxygen. So for example, the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. Notice one oxygen per carbon and two hydrogens per carbon. If you have a 5-carbon sugar like fructose, it's going to be C5H10O5. But you don't really need to know that. All you need to know is the chemical formula for glucose. And I am going to shove that chemical formula in your faces quite a bit to help you remember it. In fact, a lot of the monosaccharides, sugars, etc. that I'm going to show you are going to be glucose. So these are two different models of glucose here. And I wanted to show you these because glucose has, and a lot of these monosaccharides, sorry, apparently my cat has decided she wants to teach you as well. A lot of these monosaccharides have both a linear structure and a ring structure. And I don't want you to get confused if you see either one of these. You're more commonly going to see the ring structure, especially in diagrams showing you polymers of carbohydrates, but occasionally you might see the linear structure. It's the same molecule, same properties, it's just a different configuration of it. And a lot of the names of these monosaccharides, as well as some of the simpler polymers that are made from these monosaccharides, will end in ose. Ose is an ending that means sugar. And apparently my cat wants you to know she's sweet as well. All right, so here are some common monosaccharides, and what I wanted to show you about these is you'll notice that you have some, there were supposed to be more hexagons that showed up. So the hexagons that you see, which there was one that was supposed to show up around glucose, those are hexoses or 6-carbon sugars, and they're often drawn as hexagons. So a lot of times in some of these more complicated biological molecules, you'll see a hexagon, and that represents one of these 6-carbon sugars, most often glucose. Then you also have, and I don't know why this is not showing up, but you also have pentoses, which are 5-carbon sugars. And these are usually drawn as pentagons. And these are going to become especially important when we talk about nucleic acids, because nucleic acids have a more complicated structure, part of which is to contain a pentose sugar. So you're going to see that word again. And just a reminder that all monomers in these biomolecules are joined into polymers to form polymers by dehydration synthesis, which we talked about in lesson 1.3. And polymers are broken down into monomers by the process of hydrolysis, which we also talked about in that lesson. So a small type of polymer is called for carbohydrates is called a disaccharide. So di means two. And literally, disaccharides are two sugars or two monomers that are bound together. The only reason I wanted to mention them is because they do play an important role in biology, especially serving as a short-term energy source for a lot of organisms. So I don't know if you've heard sucrose before. Sucrose is a disaccharide. This is actually table sugar. And this is the sugar that you can buy in the grocery store. This is the sugar that you might put in coffee or tea or on cereal. Lactose is milk sugar, and it gives milk that hint of sweetness because disaccharides tend to taste sweet. And then maltose is malt sugar. Honestly, the best example of malt sugar is supposed to be in beer, and you're not supposed to know what that tastes like, high school students. All right. So just wanted to point out before we move into the polymers of carbohydrates that the way monomers are joined together and some kind of chemical details of monomers that we're not going to go into because that's way beyond the scope of what we need to know, but it's something you could learn in organic chemistry that can affect the structure and function of these polymers. So, for instance, the 3D structure of these molecules can be affected by how these monomers are formed, their formation, and also that can affect the function and the way these molecules interact with other molecules. The big example of this that I'm going to show you is starch and cellulose. These are both polymers that are found in plants, produced by plants. So if you eat anything that contains a plant, you might have some starch in it, you might have some cellulose in it, but there are some significant differences in their 3D structure that you may not necessarily see in some of the 2D diagrams we're going to look at, but these are different enough that enzymes that animals like ourselves produce can break down starch, but we cannot break down cellulose. It is inaccessible to our bodies as a form of nutrition. In fact, cellulose can only be broken down by some bacteria. So I just wanted to show you this real quick. You do not need to be able to recognize these, and you do not need to really be able to identify a starch versus cellulose. I just wanted to show you this example. So notice in a starch, look at how the oxygen that's joining these glucose molecules, because both of these are just chains of glucose molecules, are oriented versus how they're oriented in cellulose. Notice they kind of alternate going up versus down, and the big deal about that is that allows for the formation of some hydrogen bonds between cellulose that makes cellulose kind of stick together, whereas you don't see those hydrogen bonds here in the starch. And I also apologize because when I stick my hand on my tablet to write, it for some reason decides to pull up the laser pointer. I'll see if I can fix that later. So polysaccharides are also called complex carbohydrates. That's the fancy name for the polymer. Remember, poly means many and saccharide means sugar. And for some reason, all right. So polysaccharides are covalently bound monosaccharides, monosaccharides bound together. And I want to point out that each of these little hexagons that you see, each of those is actually a glucose molecule. So these are 3 different polysaccharides that you can form just making one monomer, all completely glucose molecules. But depending on how they're bound together, that affects their 3D structure, which also affects their function as well. So these can be linear, meaning they form a line, or they can be branched. So you see a linear starch right here, which is called amylose, but you can also see a branched starch, which is called amylopectin. You don't need to memorize those names. I'm just saying them so you see the difference. Notice glycogen is going to be also a branched polysaccharide, and I'll talk about the importance of those in a little bit. And then we have our cellulose again, and it is technically a linear polysaccharide. A lot of these bonds in here that you see kind of joining these different rows, those are actually hydrogen bonds. They're not covalent bonds. So we say that cellulose is a linear polysaccharide as well. So just some common polysaccharides, ones that are produced by and found in plants are going to be starches like the amylose and amylopectin on the previous slide. These primarily act as a source of energy and a form of energy storage, whereas cellulose, which is also produced in plants, is a structural support that's found in cell walls, and it makes those cell walls stiff and able to help support the body of the plant. Those that are produced in other organisms like animals and fungi are glycogen, which is the primary form of energy storage in animal cells, and then chitin, which is found in both fungi in their cell walls and is found in the exoskeletons of animals. And it's also going to be a structural support molecule. And just to kind of illustrate this, I want you to look at these forms of energy storage. So this is a starch, and this is glycogen. Notice the similarities in their structure versus cellulose and chitin. So there are branched forms of starches. So you can have linear or branched starches, but notice that you kind of see some variation in the three-dimensional structure of starch and glycogen, whereas cellulose and chitin, these are linear and they are going to form chains. And those chains, and then also any hydrogen bonding between those chains, is going to allow them to form this kind of stiffer structure that allows them to serve as more of structural support molecules rather than energy storage. Here's a basic summary slide that tells you some of the functions of carbohydrates, where they can be found in cells. And don't worry if you don't remember these cell locations, we'll talk about them in Unit 2. The monomer, so monosaccharide, and some examples of, and these are all actually, except for glucose, which is a monosaccharide, the rest of these are polymers, which I should have included there. And I could not find a good Bitmoji that matches with this topic, so I decided to show you the sweetest of my cats, my two girls, and they are staring at you from their little cat pile.